Welcome to Project Blackwood.
I have this massive stack of files spread out across the table today, and
It is a mountain of paper.
it really is. And the numbers staring back present. One of the most brutal, almost unbelievable contrasts I think we've ever encountered.
Right.
Today, our mission is to dissect the absolute anatomy of an empire's decay.
And to do that, we've pulled primary sources from everywhere. Historical biographies, SEC filings, internal legal transcripts from the late 80s, global supply chain audits.
The paper trail is remarkable. You rarely get to see the entire life cycle of market dominance documented this thoroughly.
And that dominance is exactly where I want to start, actually. I'm looking at a domestic market share report from 1989.
Okay.
At that time, this company commanded a staggering 71% of the United States chicken market.
71.
71%. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that.
That's not just market dominance. That's a functional monopoly on a massive segment of the American diet.
Right. They weren't just participating in the market, they were the environment itself.
Exactly. At 71%, you aren't really competing with other concepts. You're essentially only competing against yourself.
And the macroeconomic climate.
Right. You dictate the pricing, the supply chain, the entire consumer expectation.
But then I pull the second file. This is from fiscal year 2024.
And it's bad.
The reality here is entirely inverted. Domestic consumer spending for this exact same brand contracted by 4%.
Down to what?
Down to $4.34 billion. And here's the real gut punch. They have been relegated to the number 23 spot in the overall United States quick service restaurant sector.
Number 23.
Yeah.
From an absolute monopoly to barely scraping the top 25.
The market cap has evaporated from its peak domestic dominance. The physical stores have hollowed out.
The geographic stronghold has completely inverted.
Which brings us to the core mystery of this investigation. And I want you listening to keep this question in the back of your mind as we sift through this evidence.
How does an empire scale to almost 32,000 locations? Wait, let me check this number. Yes, 31,981 locations across 145 countries.
While simultaneously collapsing and suffocating in the very home market where it once held absolute authority.
It's a profound paradox. You have an entity ostensibly thriving on a global scale, generating tens of billions of dollars, yet structurally dying at its roots.
And there's a tragic irony here that we're going to unearth today. This is a brand built entirely on the premise of surviving a massive disruption.
Specifically, a highway bypass in 1956.
Exactly. It threatened to wipe them out completely. Yet today, they are being completely bypassed by a demographic shift they simply refuse to acknowledge.
So we're going to trace this evidence. We need to figure out how the ultimate disruptor became fundamentally incompatible with the modern consumer.
Tracing this back to the origin point in the archival data, you really have to start with the founder's psychological profile.
Because this isn't your standard corporate origin story. It's not some well-capitalized visionary with an MBA.
No, not at all. Looking at the biographical data from 1890 through the 1930s, the DNA of this company is entirely rooted in desperation.
And extreme volatility.
I'm looking at this background file on the founder right now, and it reads less like a business resume and more like a survival diary.
Born in 1890, father dies when he's 6.
Drops out of school in the 7th grade to work as a farmhand for $4 a month.
And before he even touches the restaurant industry, his career path is it's absolute chaos.
Streetcar conductor, railroad fireman.
Insurance salesman, ferry boat operator. He was constantly in motion.
Constantly trying to outrun poverty.
And constantly clashing with authority.
Wait, there's a note in this file that I had to read twice. He even tries being a lawyer.
He does.
But he gets fired after getting into a physical altercation with his own client in the courtroom. He literally fought his own client.
He did. And that level of professional instability, that combativeness, it's highly revealing. It shows a man who is fiercely independent to a fault. Someone who relies entirely on sheer force of will because he cannot function within a traditional system.
Right, because he doesn't even open his first cafe until he's 40 years old.
In 1930. And it's not even a standalone restaurant.
It's a small dining room physically attached to a standard oil service station in North Thorburn, Kentucky.
So he's sketching interstate truck drivers.
He's entirely dependent on the flow of the existing infrastructure. He isn't a destination, he's a pit stop.
Exactly. He's capturing transient demand. And when you're dealing with transient demand, the rules of engagement are entirely different than, say, a neighborhood diner.
I think that explains this note from 1939, because this is usually where the historical narrative gets heavily romanticized, right?
Heavily. The myth is that he tinkered away, created this magical blend of 11 herbs and spices.
The cafe burns down, he rebuilds it, introduces his masterpiece.
Right. But looking at the margins and the operational data from that time, this adoption of the commercial pressure cooker tells a totally different story.
Pop culture remembers it as a stroke of culinary genius. But from an investigative standpoint, it was an aggressive operational necessity.
Let me ask you this, because I'm trying to visualize the kitchen in 1939. Why was the pressure cooker so critical? Was it really just about the taste?
Think about his primary customer base. Interstate travelers and truck drivers, what is their absolute primary constraint?
Time.
Right, it isn't money, it's time. If a truck driver pulls into that Standard Oil station, they need to eat and get back on the road.
You cannot pan-fry a batch of bone-in chicken for 30 to 40 minutes and expect a trucker on a tight schedule to just wait around.
Pan-frying was a massive operational bottleneck.
Precisely. If 4 people order chicken, your kitchen is paralyzed for half an hour.
So the commercial pressure cooker wasn't about making the food strictly better.
I mean, it did happen to lock in moisture and flavor, but no. It was about drastically reducing preparation time to increase throughput.
He cut the cooking time down from 35 minutes to less than 10.
So it was an operational necessity disguised as a culinary innovation.
He was engineering a fast food supply chain before the concept of fast food even fully existed. He was optimizing for speed.
He realized that in the restaurant business, time is inventory. If you can turn over a table 4 times as fast, you quadruple your revenue potential.
Without expanding your physical footprint.
That is an industrial engineering mindset applied to a roadside diner.
Flipping ahead in these records, we hit 1956, and this seems to be the existential crisis that bakes that hyper-resilience directly into the corporate DNA.
A new interstate highway bypass, Interstate 75.
It's built, and it circumvents his business entirely. The traffic flow it stops. The business is dead.
He's forced to sell the property at a massive loss just to pay his debts.
Look at the sheer mathematics of his situation in 1956. Let's really sit with this.
He's 66 years old.
His business of 25 years is gone. His primary income is a $105 a month Social Security check.
By any conventional metric, his business life is over. It is time to retire quietly.
But he doesn't. There are multiple historical documents here detailing what happens next. And honestly, it sounds exhausting just reading it.
He takes that $105, loads up his car with pressure cookers and bags of seasoning, and just travels the United States.
Literally sleeping in the back of his car, pulling into random independent restaurants and pitching his pressure-cooked chicken and recipe as a franchise model.
He cooks for the restaurant owners, and if they like it, he asks for a nickel for every chicken they sell using his method.
And look at the rejection rate documented in those early days. It says here he faced 1,009 rejections before securing his next major deal.
Wait, 1,009?
1,009. That cannot be a real number, right? That has to be corporate myth-making.
Even if the exact integer is slightly mythologized, the scale of the rejection is thoroughly documented.
Let's say it was only 500.
Driving across the country, sleeping in your car at age 66 and being told no hundreds upon hundreds of times.
That is not just perseverance. That is a pathological refusal to accept defeat.
So how does that psychology affect the company he eventually builds?
When you finally secure a franchise network after that many rejections, the culture you build into that network is going to be incredibly defensive.
Fiercely independent, highly aggressive.
That desperate DNA became the foundation of how these early franchisees operated. They weren't standard corporate employees filling out HR forms.
They were independent risk takers buying into a survivor's model. They adopted his combative, hyper-resilient mindset.
Okay, that context completely changes how I'm looking at this next set of files. I'm pulling the capitalization tables from the early franchising era, specifically 1964 to 1971.
Because if his model was born out of such desperate survival and grinding for nickels, the math here is completely contradictory.
The scale-up is genuinely dizzying.
The financial velocity of this era is almost unprecedented for a physical restaurant chain.
In 1964, the founder is 74 years old. He is completely overwhelmed by the rapid expansion of roughly 600 franchise locations.
He simply cannot manage the logistics of shipping spice packets to 600 restaurants.
So he sells the corporate entity to an investment group. The private valuation, $2 million.
$2 million for a system with 600 locations.
Even adjusting for inflation, that suggests they were capturing the brand and the royalty streams for an absolute fraction of their intrinsic value.
He retained a lifetime salary, a seat on the board, and brand ambassador status. But the operational control was officially gone.
And look at what the investment group immediately does with it. It's instant hypergrowth. By March 1966, the stock begins trading over-the-counter at $21.50 a share.
By January 1969, they officially list on the New York Stock Exchange.
And then, in July 1971, a massive conglomerate called Hybline acquires the entity for $285 million.
Wait, cross-referencing that timeline. From a $2 million private valuation in 1964 to a $285 million acquisition in 1971.
That is a 14,000% increase in valuation in 7 years.
A 14,000% return in 7 years on fried chicken. I have to express genuine skepticism at those numbers. How does a physical restaurant footprint scale that fast without fundamentally fracturing its own foundation?
It's a great question.
You're building physical stores, training localized staff, establishing regional supply chains. You cannot just command and control that kind of physical growth without immense friction. What was the catalyst?
The documentation points to the franchise structure itself. They had a strictly limited menu, almost exclusively bone-in chicken, mashed potatoes, coleslaw, and biscuits.
Which severely streamlined the supply chain. You didn't need complex kitchens.
But the real accelerant was the initial franchise fee. There's a ledger entry here. They were charging just $3,000 for an initial franchise fee.
$3,000 in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Let me do the math on that. Even adjusted for inflation, that is incredibly low. That barely covers the cost of the specialized fryers.
Why would they give away the intellectual property for practically nothing? I was wondering the exact same thing. Why not charge $50,000? Why not extract more upfront capital?
Because they weren't optimizing for upfront capital. They were optimizing for a land grab.
Exactly.
A $3,000 barrier to entry means any moderately successful local restaurateur could afford to flip their diner into a franchise overnight.
They traded immediate capitalization for rapid geographic saturation. They wanted a location on every main street in America before anyone else realized what was happening.
And it worked. It created an absolute segment monopoly.
I'm looking at the competitive benchmarking files from this era. It notes that McDonald's was heavily dominating the hamburger sector, but they were completely ignoring the poultry sector.
Ray Kromek was obsessed with beef and fries.
So you have this hyper-aggressive franchise model, a highly specialized pressure frying technology that no competitor could easily mimic at scale, and zero macro competition from the biggest fast food player in the room.
Which explains the attrition of the imitators. When a sector shows a 14,000% valuation growth, you always get a wave of fast followers.
The files definitely show that. There are mentions of regional competitors like Church's Chicken, but also this bizarre wave of celebrity-endorsed imitators in the late 1960s.
Oh, right. Minnie Pearl's Chicken? Maryland Fried Chicken?
Even country singers were trying to launch chicken franchises to siphon market share using the exact same accelerated franchising model.
But they failed completely, didn't they?
Spectacularly.
Yeah.
The data shows they suffered from severe undercapitalization and massive operational inconsistencies.
One document notes that Minnie Pearl's Chicken had instances where different stores had completely different recipes.
They didn't have the proprietary pressure cooker technology, and more importantly, they didn't have that hardened, desperate DNA that was drilled into the early network.
By 1970, this brand ranked 6th in overall volume among all food service companies in the United States.
But here is the danger of that unbridled velocity. When you grow that fast and generate that much cash, you inevitably attract conglomerate attention.
And conglomerates almost always fundamentally misunderstand the asset they're purchasing.
They look at a spreadsheet, see the cash flow, and think they can manage it like a factory.
That perfectly frames the next phase of this paper trail. The Hybline acquisition in '71 was just the beginning of the corporate hot potato.
Hybline was primarily a packaged food and spirits distributor. They owned Smirnoff vodka.
Then R.J. Reynolds, a massive tobacco giant, acquires Hybline in 1982, inheriting the chicken chain along with the vodka.
Tobacco executives running a poultry franchise, you can already see the disconnect.
But it gets worse. Digging into the corporate ownership chain, we hit a massive file from 1986. This is the PepsiCo acquisition.
PepsiCo buys the brand from R.J. Reynolds for $840 million.
Now, tracing the logic of vertical integration here, from a spreadsheet perspective in 1986, I can actually see why PepsiCo CEO Wayne Calloway made this move.
Let's look at the macro environment.
Pepsi is a beverage company fighting a brutal global war against Coca-Cola. The fountain drink business is critical.
If you acquire massive fast food chains, and we know they also acquired Taco Bell and Pizza Hut around this era, you instantly create a captive distribution channel for your soda.
You're buying guaranteed customers.
Exactly. You rip out all the Coca-Cola dispensers in thousands of restaurants and replace them with Pepsi.
You lock competitors out of thousands of high-volume fountain drink locations. The syrup margins are incredible, so the synergy makes logical sense on paper.
I see the synergy on paper. Pepsi gets a captive audience for its liquids. But operationally, how does a company that bottles liquids successfully run thousands of localized fryers?
They don't.
Because looking at the internal memos documented here, this reads like pure corporate arrogance. PepsiCo is fundamentally a consumer packaged goods or CPG conglomerate.
And we need to define what that means for you listening. A CPG company's core competency is manufacturing a shelf-stable product like syrup or potato chips, bottling or bagging it in a massive centralized factory, and shipping it to grocery stores.
It's a rigid, highly centralized top-down operation. Everything is uniform.
And quick service restaurants are the exact opposite of that. They are hyper-localized, they are labor-intensive.
You're dealing with perishable goods, teenage employees, localized health inspectors,
and fast-moving environments run by independent franchisees who own their small slice of the territory.
Trying to manage a restaurant franchise network with the methodology of a beverage bottler seems structurally impossible.
It's entirely incompatible. A franchisee who has been frying chicken for 20 years does not want to take operational orders from an executive in Purchase, New York, whose only prior experience is optimizing aluminum can distribution.
That culture clash exploded, and it's heavily documented in these legal filings from the late 80s.
Unearthing the details of the 1976 franchise agreement.
Now, this was a precedent-setting document signed years before PepsiCo arrived. It heavily protected franchisee territorial rights and guaranteed their independence.
It basically said, you own a mile radius, we won't build another store near you, and you run your kitchen.
A classic protectionist agreement built to keep the early network happy.
Right. But PepsiCo comes in and immediately tries to force these rigid, top-down mandates.
They attempt to unilaterally change the 1976 agreement. There are memos here detailing PepsiCo demanding mandatory store remodels, imposing completely unsustainable capital requirements on the local operators.
They wanted to homogenize the brand, stripping away localized menu items and enforcing strict corporate uniformity.
They wanted the restaurants to function like vending machines. Predictable, uniform, and entirely submissive to the parent company.
Which triggers an absolute corporate civil war.
I have the docket here for the 1989 franchise lawsuit. The operators literally take their corporate parent to court for breach of contract.
This is a devastating moment in the timeline. The corporate entity went to outright war with its own foundation.
Think about the internal friction that requires. You don't sue your parent company unless things are fundamentally broken.
The people physically breading the chicken and interacting with the community are actively suing the executives.
And it reveals the deep operational rot of the conglomerate era. There's a financial analysis in this legal file showing that PepsiCo was trying to compete with McDonald's on value pricing across its entire portfolio.
They forced the chicken chain to offer aggressive discounts, totally ignoring the specialized nature of the poultry supply chain.
You cannot value price bone-in chicken the same way you value price a frozen hamburger patty.
The commodity costs are completely different. The preparation labor is different.
If you force a franchisee to sell a complex product at a discount just to match McDonald's billboard, you destroy their margins.
And that is exactly what happened. The restaurant division became a severe drag on PepsiCo's overall return on invested capital.
They spent a decade fighting their own operators before they finally realized that running a restaurant requires core competencies entirely separate from selling soda.
Which is an incredibly expensive lesson to learn. You spend nearly $1 billion to buy a captive fountain drink audience, only to realize the restaurants themselves are bleeding cash because you don't know how to run them.
This realization pulls us to a massive structural shift documented in 1997. It's the Tricon Global spinoff.
In January 1997, PepsiCo announces the tax-free spinoff of its entire restaurant division, this brand, Pizza Hut and Taco Bell, into an independent, publicly owned entity called Tricon Global Restaurants.
We know it today as Yum Brands.
It was an admission of defeat by PepsiCo, a massive corporate retreat.
But it was also a necessary liberation for the restaurants. They were finally free from the beverage executives.
But they were severely damaged. I found the transcript from CEO David Novak shortly after the spinoff, addressing the shareholders in his annual letter.
This is a rare piece of executive candor. Usually these letters are just PR fluff.
But I want to read this exactly as it appears because the weight of this confession is staggering. He writes, "The usual course of action is for the chairman to start the annual letter with a statement about all the progress. However, I want you to know that we don't think we're nearly as good as we should be at doing what matters most in our industry, running great restaurants and making our customers happy."
Let that sink in.
That is a remarkable statement for a CEO to make on the record.
He essentially admits they forgot how to do their jobs.
Exactly. To state to your shareholders that after a decade of corporate management under one of the biggest CPG companies in the world, you have fundamentally forgotten how to run a great restaurant.
It completely recontextualizes the previous 10 years as a lost decade. They weren't innovating, they were just degrading.
And buying their freedom did not come cheap. I'm looking at the balance sheets from 2001. Tricon Global had to absorb significant leverage to execute this spinoff from PepsiCo.
I'm looking at $2.427 billion in long-term debt by 2001.
$2.4 billion in debt at the turn of the millennium. We need to explain what that actually means for a company's strategy.
When you're carrying that much leverage, your entire operational philosophy has to change.
You cannot play aggressive offense. You cannot take massive risks on new menu innovations or radical store redesigns.
Because every quarter, a massive chunk of your cash flow is going just to service the interest on that debt.
You're playing not to lose, rather than playing to win.
Precisely. You're no longer focused on dominating the market. You are focused on structural survival.
You have to be ruthless about cost-cutting and operational discipline just to keep the bankers at bay.
But unit economics did improve initially, to their credit. Unearthing the average unit volume, or AUV, data, and for you listening, AUV is a critical metric.
It isn't just a vanity number. It's the heartbeat of a restaurant.
It tells us exactly how much gross revenue a single physical store brings in over a year. It measures the raw health of the locations.
In the United States, AUV improved from $786,000 in 1997 to $865,000 by 2001.
So the operational focus of finally being an independent restaurant company was accretive. They were getting back to basics.
But that heavy debt load meant they had to rely on strategic refranchising, selling corporate-owned stores back to independent operators to raise cash just to stay above water.
It was a slow, grinding recovery at home.
But here's where the story fractures. Because while the domestic core was fighting to survive its own debt and repair its fractured franchise relations,
the geographic center of gravity for this entire enterprise was quietly shifting to the other side of the planet.
Wait, shifting the physical paper trail over to this 1987 file.
Yeah.
This is an incredible revelation.
We're looking at a location near Tiananmen Square in Beijing in November 1987.
The brand becomes the first Western fast food chain to penetrate the Chinese market.
And this is where the grand rug pull of the corporate strategy occurs. Think about what we just discussed.
We spent all this time dissecting the American operational identity, the desperate DNA of the founder, the fierce franchise battles over territorial rights, the rigid bone-in menu, the culture clashes.
But the data reveals that the company's greatest historical success came from completely and utterly abandoning its American operational identity.
The localized supply chain data here is fascinating. Instead of imposing a rigid Western menu like PepsiCo tried to do in America, they did the exact opposite in China.
They engaged in strategic joint ventures with local partners. They integrated Chinese cultural preferences directly into the core offerings.
I have a list of menu items here from the early 2000s. They were selling egg tarts, congee for breakfast, dragon twisters with Peking duck sauce, soy sauce chicken.
They completely localized the palate.
There's a quote here from Warren Liu, a former vice president of business development for the region, and he lays out a philosophy that broke all the corporate rules back in the U.S.
Read that.
He states, "Strategy is context dependent. A strategy that works well in a stable and mature market economy would most likely not work well in China, given the diversity of its people, and a rapidly and continuously changing business environment."
Strategy is context dependent. It sounds obvious, but it is the exact opposite of the traditional American fast food export model.
That model relies on strict homogenization.
Yeah.
McDonald's wants a Big Mac to taste exactly the same in Tokyo as it does in Chicago as it does in London. The uniformity is the product.
But here, the brand actively dismantled its homogeneity. They allowed the local context to dictate the menu, the store design, and the supply chain.
Wait, I'm pulling up the unit economics matrix for the Chinese market in 2020, and I have to stop because the numbers here are so aggressive they almost look like a typo.
But look at this sheet. Store build cost is $400,000 USD. Cash profit per unit is $200,000 USD.
Pre-tax ROI on new units is 55%, with a 1.8-year payback period.
Let me look at that. 55% pre-tax return on investment.
A 1.8-year payback period for a physical brick-and-mortar restaurant.
That seems impossible. A payback period of less than 2 years.
For context, in the food service industry, if you invest $1 million to build a store, and you get a payback period of 4 to 5 years, meaning it takes 5 years of profits to recoup your initial investment, you are thrilled. That is a highly successful store.
To recoup your initial capital expenditure in 1.8 years means the cash velocity is almost frictionless. You open the doors and it just prints money.
It says here they were hitting cash margins of 23%.
That validates the aggressive expansion. If every dollar you spend building a store generates that kind of return, you don't slow down. You build as many as physically possible, as fast as you can secure the real estate.
Which they absolutely did. Cross-referencing the geographic reach metrics by 2025, Yum China is operating an astounding 11,943 units.
Nearly 12,000 restaurants.
The domestic U.S. footprint is vastly overshadowed. The entire entity has permanently inverted.
It's now fundamentally an international business, specifically an Asian business, that just happens to have a struggling legacy footprint in the United States.
And they adapted technologically in a way the U.S. market entirely failed to do.
The notes here indicate that delivery sales currently constitute 42% of total revenue in China.
They built a robust, digital-first infrastructure integrated with local super apps like WeChat.
They were doing mobile ordering and specialized delivery logistics, while the American counterpart was still relying on people pulling up to a static drive-through window and shouting into a speaker box for a family bucket.
The contrast is jarring. You have a cutting-edge tech logistics company operating in Shanghai and a 1970s nostalgia brand struggling in Ohio.
Which perfectly connects back to the rotting domestic and Western core, because while China was exploding, the West was quietly compressing.
And the warning signs are always buried in the margins before they hit the revenue.
Tracing the margin compression data from 2016 onward, it reads like a slow-motion warning system that corporate leadership either ignored or couldn't fix.
Let me read this historical gross margin descent because the trend line is terrifying.
Go ahead.
In 2016, gross margins were 32.41%. In 2017, they dropped to 30.22%. 2018 is 28.80%. 2019 is 28.15%. By 2024, they're down to 26.15% and tracking toward 24.59% in 2025.
When gross margins compress consistently over an 8-year period, it whispers that a fundamental structural problem exists long before the financial press writes a headline about it.
To you and me hitting the drive-thru, margin compression is largely invisible, right? We just notice that the family bucket suddenly costs $35 instead of $20, and maybe the pieces seem a little smaller.
But internally, what does this data actually mean for the company?
Internally, it means you are bleeding pricing power. Gross margin is what you have left after paying for the raw materials, the chicken, the oil, the flour, the direct labor.
If that margin shrinks from 32% to 24%, it means your supply chain costs are skyrocketing. But you cannot raise your menu prices fast enough to cover the spread because consumers will just stop coming.
Every single year, you're paying more to earn less. It's a slow, suffocating squeeze.
And digging into the supply chain vulnerabilities that caused that squeeze, we unearthed the 2018 United Kingdom operational failure.
This is where the theoretical margin compression on a spreadsheet becomes a physical catastrophe in the real world.
The documentation here exposes a fatal logistics pivot.
Let's trace the mechanics of this failure, because it's a masterclass in financial optimization overriding operational reality.
The regional operation in the UK decided to abandon their existing logistics partner, a company called Bidvest.
Now, Bidvest had institutional knowledge. They utilized 6 different distribution centers, strategically scattered across the UK to handle time-sensitive, chilled poultry.
But corporate decided to transition the entire contract to DHL to save money.
And how did DHL structure their distribution?
DHL utilized only a single distribution center, one facility in Rugby, England.
A single point of failure for a nationwide network of highly perishable goods. Chilled chicken has an incredibly short shelf life.
It's not frozen. It cannot sit in a warehouse for a month. The logistics have to be perfectly synchronized.
And they weren't. The files detail that the integration of a third-party computer system completely collapsed.
DHL had a massive lack of institutional experience in chilled food distribution. There's actually a footnote here noting they had previously failed at distributing to Burger King.
The result? A massive bottleneck at the Rugby facility. Trucks were waiting for hours, chicken was spoiling, and deliveries simply stopped.
Imagine being a store manager in London or Manchester. You unlock the doors for the lunch rush, you walk into the back, look in the walk-in fridge, and realize a global chicken empire literally forgot to ship you the chicken.
It's almost comical if it wasn't so devastating to the franchisees.
It led to widespread, temporary store closures across the entire United Kingdom. Hundreds of stores just shut their doors.
The operational hubris here is staggering. To transition a highly specialized, perishable supply chain to a single distribution center without parallel testing.
It resulted in the ultimate tragic irony, a chicken restaurant running out of chicken.
It perfectly illustrates what happens when you prioritize spreadsheet efficiencies over the physical reality of your product.
It's the exact moment the disruptor becomes the disrupted. And that disruption wasn't just happening in the supply chain, it was happening in the very demographics they relied on.
Pulling the competitive benchmarking files from 2020 through 2025, this era is colloquially termed the chicken wars.
And the data shows a catastrophic domestic contraction.
This is where we see the precise consequence of clinging to a legacy identity. The macro environment had shifted radically, but the brand was still acting like it was 1989.
Drive-through consumers demand portability. Modern fast food is entirely built around the car and the commute.
You cannot easily eat a massive piece of bone-in fried chicken while driving a Honda Civic down the interstate.
That's messy, it requires two hands, it has bones.
It's a fundamentally anti-convenience product in an era defined by hyper-convenience.
Looking back at the historical timeline, there was a massive foreshadowing event that the legacy brand entirely missed.
In 1983, McDonald's launched the Chicken McNugget.
That was the signal flare. The McNugget wasn't just a new menu item, it was a fundamental paradigm shift in how consumers interacted with poultry.
It signaled that the future was boneless, highly portable, highly standardized, and dip-friendly. It turned chicken into a driving food.
The corporate archives show they saw the McNugget and they retaliated defensively in 1985 with something called Kentucky Nuggets.
But it was a half measure. The core identity of the brand remained rigidly tethered to the traditional bone-in family bucket.
They viewed boneless chicken as an ancillary side item, a gimmick for kids, not the primary vehicle for future growth.
And that generational blind spot compounded over 30 years. They protected their legacy product while the entire market moved past it.
By the time we hit the 2020s, the dietary preferences of Generation Z have completely evolved.
Between 2020 and 2025, overall United States sales of bone-in chicken declined by 4% across the entire industry, while boneless product sales surged by 11%.
Cross-referencing that against the competitor metrics, the results are absolutely devastating for the legacy brand.
Let's look at Chick-fil-A.
They operate roughly 3,000 units in the U.S., compared to this legacy brand's 4,000 units. Yet Chick-fil-A captured a dominant 45.5% market share in the chicken segment in 2023.
Wait, look at their average unit volume. The AUV file for Chick-fil-A.
I'm looking at it. Chick-fil-A is generating an unparalleled $8.7 million in annual sales per location.
$8.7 million. Compare that to the legacy brand's numbers we uncovered earlier from 2001, which were under $1 million.
Even adjusting heavily for modern inflation, the legacy brand AUV is a fraction of that.
How is Chick-fil-A pushing $9 million through a single physical box?
The operational audit here breaks it down. They achieve $8.7 million per box through vastly superior drive-through logistics, multi-lane staging, employees outside with tablets processing orders upstream,
An uncompromising focus on premium boneless sandwiches that can be assembled in seconds, and incredibly high customer service standards.
They capitalized on exactly what the modern consumer demanded: speed, portability, and consistency. While the legacy brand was still trying to sell complex, time-consuming buckets,
Chick-fil-A optimized the exact same constraint that the founder did in 1939, time. But they did it for the modern era.
and it's not just Chick-fil-A eating their lunch. The file on Popeyes shows they hold an 11.9% market share, completely capturing the cultural zeitgeist with their 2019 chicken sandwich launch.
They created massive viral demand that directly cannibalized the traditional demographic.
Then you have brands like Raising Cane's achieving 31% consumer spend growth, and Wingstop hitting a staggering 41% growth in 2024.
Both of those emerging brands index heavily with Generation Z. They use robust digital media strategies, authentic lifestyle marketing, and strict adherence to highly simplified, boneless, and tender-focused menus.
They don't sell 50 different items. They sell variations of one highly portable item.
Which brings us to perhaps the most chilling data point in this entire dossier. I was cross-checking the demographic reality of the legacy brand today.
Generation Z currently constitutes merely 6% of their total customer base.
6%.
Only 6% of their customers are young adults.
That is a demographic death sentence. If you cannot capture the emerging consumer class, your brand effectively ages out with its existing customer base.
It means every single year, your addressable market naturally shrinks as your older customers die or change their dietary habits.
You're fighting a war of attrition that you mathematically cannot win.
And the human toll of this shrinkage is severe. Sifting through the workforce reduction reports from 2020 to 2025, we cannot treat this layoff data merely as statistical noise on a balance sheet.
These are communities and livelihoods deeply affected by corporate stagnation.
You see the cascading effects internationally first. The macroeconomic and geopolitical headwinds are brutal when you operate in 145 countries.
I'm unearthing the records from the Bahamas in 2021. 35 layoffs across 9 locations.
And the stated rationale from the local operators wasn't about the quality of the food. It was entirely about the environment.
Government-imposed 9 p.m. curfews eliminated the entire nighttime business segment.
It made the massive dine-in restaurant models completely unviable, restricting operations solely to the drive-through window.
Think about that structural vulnerability. A massive dine-in model that was already antiquated in the United States suddenly became legally impossible to operate during prime hours in international territories due to public health mandates.
The physical real estate became a massive liability.
Then we trace the data to Indonesia. In Q3 of 2025, the brand operating under the FASA ticker on their local exchange closed 19 outlets and laid off 400 employees.
And that was preceded by 47 outlet closures and 2,274 layoffs in 2024, over 2,600 people losing their jobs.
The rationale listed in the financial disclosures there points to expiring lease agreements, sluggish household purchasing power post-COVID, and intense consumer boycotts linked to geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East.
It shows the inherent fragility of a massive global footprint. When you plant your flag in 145 countries, you are entirely exposed to local macro shocks, currency devaluations, and geopolitical anger that the corporate headquarters in Kentucky has absolutely zero control over.
But the hollowing out isn't just international. Digging into the November 2024 United States corporate layoffs, these were initiated by the brand's largest domestic franchisee.
The core driver was a sustained domestic same-store sales decline, down 7% one quarter, down 5% the next, compounded by completely underperforming limited-time offers that failed to move the needle.
And this is where the dissonance between the internal reality on the ground and the external public relations from corporate becomes truly jarring.
You have massive franchisees initiating mass layoffs, closing stores because they're bleeding same-store sales.
Yet the corporate messaging remains artificially, almost delusionally buoyant.
I have the transcript right here from Yum Brand CEO David Gibbs in late 2024. He highlights an 8% core operating profit growth for the parent company, boasting about Taco Bell's 9% same-store sales growth, and talking about how the international division is accelerating.
But he completely omits the U.S. domestic growth metrics from his executive highlights.
Of course he omits it. You don't highlight a 5% decline in your foundational legacy market when you're on an earnings call trying to project global resilience to institutional investors.
You hide the rot behind the success of Taco Bell.
It gets even more surreal. In the midst of these domestic sales slumps, while local franchisees are firing staff just to make rent, corporate releases a press statement announcing an industry-first collaboration with NVIDIA to accelerate the development of innovative AI technologies to integrate AI into our restaurants at an unprecedented scale.
It's the ultimate hollow corporate optimism. It's a classic misdirection tactic.
AI in a fried chicken drive-thru.
Exactly. When the physical fundamentals of your business selling hot chicken out of a brick-and-mortar building are failing, you pivot to the most hyped technological buzzword available to appease Wall Street.
You cannot feed an AI algorithm to a customer in a drive-thru. If your core product isn't resonating with the demographics, an NVIDIA partnership does not fix the fact that a 19-year-old doesn't want to buy a bucket of bone-in chicken.
It's treating a gaping wound with a digital Band-Aid.
The dissonance is palpable. Let's pull all this evidence together and look at the final metrics on the table.
Today, the entire system generates $26.07 billion globally. It's a massive sum of money.
But that massive top-line revenue is masking a historic gross margin compression down to 24.59% and a deeply hollowed-out United States presence.
They survived by completely abandoning their identity to become a Chinese powerhouse, while their American homeland was overrun by specialized, boneless-focused competitors.
It leaves you wondering about the alternate paths not taken, the decisions that seemed prudent at the time but doomed them decades later.
What if, instead of fiercely protecting their legacy bucket, they had aggressively cannibalized themselves?
Let's explore that what-if path. Imagine we're back in the 1990s. The Chicken McNugget is already a massive hit. The trend is obvious.
What if this legacy brand had ruthlessly cannibalized its own bone-in legacy right then?
What if they had poured their capital into dominating the boneless, portable, drive-thru trend 30 years ago instead of reacting defensively in 2024 with a slightly reorganized menu?
If they had possessed the foresight to pivot away from their founding product, they might have preempted the rise of Chick-fil-A and Wingstop. They could have owned the portable chicken sandwich space.
But structurally, you have to look at the human element. Their franchise network was deeply entrenched in the bone-in preparation methods.
They had thousands of pressure cookers designed specifically for bones. It's incredibly difficult for corporates to tell local operators who have made millions selling buckets to throw away the buckets.
It reminds me of the modern parallels we see in the tech sector. You look at a legacy giant like Intel.
They completely dominated the early hardware eras with their specific chip architectures. They were a monopoly.
But they became so culturally tethered to the very architecture that made them billions, they were too slow to adapt to the massive paradigm shift toward mobile and AI processors. They protected their legacy, allowing nimble competitors to bypass them completely.
It's the innovator's dilemma applied to poultry. The asset that builds your empire, the thing that makes you famous, eventually becomes the anchor that drowns you if you refuse to cut the rope.
As we close the file on this investigation, here's a final thought for you to mull over. What does the hollowing out of this specific legacy empire teach us about our collective obsession with relentless scale?
Consider the inherent fragility of any system that values aggressive global growth over the stability and relevance of the very foundation that built it.
When a brand spans 145 countries but loses the neighborhood it started in, is it truly expanding or just outrunning its own obsolescence?
This has been Project Blackwood.